Greetings, this is Griff Ruby, the Nostalgia Catholic, with yet another Isaac Asimov short story review, or in this case, a novelette. Rather prominent, this one. It got the cover of the November 1952 issue of Galaxy Science Fiction, and that story is The Martian Way by Isaac Asimov. You can see he's misspelled the name. Oops. I think that there was a little bit of an argument going on between Horace Gold and Isaac Asimov, so Horace was kind of deliberately sloppy. I think he wanted to misspell Asimov with an extra S, but he decided to do the other one instead. So, at any rate, that's supposed to be the Earth, and here's some rockets that maneuver around the Earth, and you can see this one here squirting something out. Apparently, in the world of the Martian Way story, the main way that rocket ships get about through the solar system is by nuclear heating of vast stores of water, which then gets squirted out at a very, very high velocity. Not a bad way to go, actually. Nice nuclear-powered rockets, you see. So why don't we go into the story itself a little bit, or let's take a look. As usual, there's, let's see. Actually, table of contents right there. First thing, Place of Honor. It's described as a novella, The Martian Way by Isaac Asimov, page 4. So let's take a look at that. It has a little bit of artwork and a small publisher's squib. It says it was junk they hunted, but enormously valuable and urgently needed junk that cost only bravery and the cheapest fuel. It'll turn out to be water, we'll get to that. Yet they were kept from collecting it by an even cheaper lie. Okay, now let's take a look at this cover. So the main sheet has a little bit of the drawing here, kind of extends here as part of the control panel, but the main drawing is these two guys here. The one seated is Ted Long, and the other one standing is Mario Esteban Rios. These two guys are in the story. Turns out that Ted Long is reading some reports and speeches from some Earth politician, apparently just named Hilder. I think that's meant to be a slight corruption of Hitler. Remember, this is not long after World War II. And which now leads to a curious background to this whole story that bears some discussion. And that was supposedly this Hilder character is supposed to be based on Senator Joseph McCarthy. A lot of people were real down on McCarthy, and that's a shame. I know time will come when he'll be recognized as the real American hero he really was, but at the time they bedeviled him and belittled him and hated him. Oh, it was hate. I mean, personally, I think the hatred they had could be if anything criminal had been done to him, I think it could properly be categorized as a hate crime. But be all that as it may, the thing was, thanks to his efforts, I think we were spared the influence of falling into communism for at least another 2 or 3 decades. But where is he now when we need him? But at any rate, Hilder had really nothing that I could see other than his apparent rank. I mean, McCarthy was a senator, and for a while he was riding high and very popular on this thing, and I guess some thought maybe he might have some presidential aspirations or something. I don't know if that could ever have gone anywhere or be even thought of that. But the the character Hilder is an assemblyman, and he's looking to become global coordinator, all apparently on the same thing. Unfortunately, there is nothing the same. Because what I looked at Hilder's activities very carefully throughout this whole story. And what he would have to be categorized as today would be a kind of environmentalist wacko. And I say that in terms of, or maybe doomsayer. I mean, we got to strike the right balance. Are there concerns, pollution, global warming, things? Yeah, you have to acknowledge that. But the doom and gloom scale of, oh my God, we're going to get into this runaway, more carbon, more fires, more carbon, more fires, and in 20 years the planet Earth's going to be uninhabitable as the planet Venus. Kind of doomsday scenario, which, that's not going to happen. I mean, I'm not even sure that could happen in 1,000 years, even if, carbon and methane dumping trends continued at their peak into the future. But, and probably they won't, because we're trying to trim these things down. And so, we trim them down in America by trying to get other countries where they don't have any laws about this stuff end up spouting all this stuff into the atmosphere without any restraint. So we'll be so careful here in America that will even shut down whole industries. But the industries are necessary, and all that happens is we depend on China and other places to do this, where they don't have any laws about causing global warming, about ejecting carbon dioxide, methane, and all the other greenhouse gases imaginable. So, I mean, I think that's that's kind of a valid concern. How much better to bring it all back here, and where at least we have some restraint, some caution, some attempt to try to do something about these things, so that it isn't so much. Well, let's not get off my soapbox. But at any rate, as I say, it is a valid concern, but it's not a doomsday thing. Well, Hilder has a valid concern too. You see, these spaceships get about, as I said, by water. Now, the Earth has a tremendous amount of water, but every time, and actually, if the spaceships are still just taking off from the Earth, apparently they're using lots and lots of water for that, but that's all inside of the Earth's atmosphere and will stay there. However, once they're beyond the Earth's atmosphere, everything they use to maneuver to all these different planets is virtually all lost. I mean, yeah, the Earth may sweep past a little bit of it in its orbital path, but basically it's lost. And if you have lots and lots of ships going all over the solar system doing all sorts of stuff, you are using, tons and tons and tons of water. And the Earth has to provide all this, and of course it all has to be lifted up off from the Earth. And Hilder is concerned that, well, if we use up all the water here on Earth, you say the Earth will become this dry, arid wasteland, where nothing can live. And if all the water's gone, yeah, he's right about that. Again, is that a concern? A little bit of one, because we're looking at what is basically a non-renewable resource. And, when this was written, they weren't too concerned about non-renewable resources yet. Now we think about that a bit more, and rightly so, I think. So Hilder is basically just an environmental. He wants to protect the Earth from losing its water. But let's take a look at the scale of that. And I'm going to look at page 20. Let's see, 26 has a calculation about how this goes here. So Sankov stretched out a pair of long legs to one side of his desk and crossed them at the ankles. Seems to me it's still pretty much of a joke. What's his argument? We're using up water. Has he tried looking at some figures? I've got them all here. Had them brought to me when this committee arrived. Seems that Earth has 400 million cubic miles of water, or about 1.5 quintillion tons, by the way, later on they say. Okay, in its oceans, and each cubic mile weighs 4.5 billion tons. That's a lot of water. Now, we use some of that heap in space flight. Most of the thrust is inside Earth's gravitational field, and that means the water thrown out finds its way back to the oceans. Hilder doesn't figure that in. When he says 1,000,000 tons of water is used up per flight, he's a liar. It's less than 100,000 tons. 100,000 tons of water is quite a bit. Suppose now we have 50,000 flights a year. We don't, of course, not even 1,500. That still would be a lot, about 1,500. Okay. But let's say there are 50,000. I figure there's going to be considerable expansion as time goes on. With 50,000 flights, 1 cubic mile of water would be lost to space each year. That sounds kind of severe, but let's see what that amounts to. This means that in 1,000,000 years, the Earth would lose 1/4 of 1% of its total water supply. So, anyway, the statistics are kind of interesting. In other words, there really is so much. I do have to factor one thought, though. Are we talking seawater or freshwater? Here's the thing. If it's just seawater, I think you have an excellent point, and Hilder is basically exaggerating. He's being a doomsday prophet when, I mean, like I said, we are dealing with a concern. Water is not a renewable resource, and what might be fine for 100 years could be a very serious disaster for, over, say, 10,000 years if human history should continue so long. So, there are some valid concerns, but I think on the whole, we're making a lot more of it than should be. And Hilder certainly was making a lot more of it than should have been. Not even willing to say, well, that's it. We'll limit the amount of water that can be shipped off the Earth to, like, next to nothing. Apparently, his motives, at least as interpreted by others, is not really clear. Appear to be that he's really kind of against progress, against space exploration, and probably against antibiotics, and against medical progress, and against, a whole lot of other things too. So, which I don't see that. I mean, McCarthy probably couldn't care less about anything like that one way or the other. He had his concern, and it was the spread of this whole idea called communism that was catching in some places. It was fashionable. You want to be this kind of mildly, fashionably subversive person, you'd be a communist. And that's what it really was. Never mind that being actually involved with communism allied you with Stalin, who was not a whole lot short of what the guys running North Korea are right now. I mean, just tyrants running, prison countries. Kept citizens. If you heard the phrase "kept woman," they got kept citizens. Whole nation's population. And that's still that way in North Korea and in some lesser degree China itself and some other places. So, I mean, you really want to be part of that, but at any rate, it was kind of fashionable in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and especially it kind of got a boost when we had to throw in with Uncle Joe, in World War II. So never mind the fact that Uncle Joe was every bit as disastrous as Hitler could have been, and vice versa. I don't know it really makes much difference which one we threw in with. Only Uncle Joe did have one real advantage, was that Hitler devoted a lot of his effort trying to go in and attack Moscow in the winter. And, well, the Germans were not ready or equipped for a Russian winter, so like Napoleon 100-something years before, weather defeated the Germans or French or whoever. Basically, weather brought about defeat. But at any rate, be all that as it may, communism, the thing is, it really could have been a very bad influence. And by the way, McCarthy himself had nothing to do with all these things like the blacklist. There were others following what he was doing and setting up these, un-American activity committees or something like that, and so forth, and doing these inspections and so forth. Good grief, you even see them taking place in a movie called The Tin Men, or tin men. You know, these guys who sell aluminum siding, and they're investigating the aluminum siding business. Well, aluminum siding was kind of a ripoff, so I mean, was that really a bad thing if they were investigating it? You know, I guess it was bad if you're an aluminum siding salesman, but for the rest of us, I mean, who really needed aluminum siding on their house? But it was a big thing, you know, back in the 50s and early 1960s. And a lot of people made a lot of money selling this stuff that, you know, didn't really do much to help your houses. People would buy it anyway, and kind of, I don't know, I think we read it for the most part. So, you know, there's a lot of this kind of stuff that kind of, like, it doesn't make any sense. Hilder, you know, what he's doing might be opposed to space progress. He wants everybody on Mars. They've got a whole big colony on Mars. It's grown and thrived and so forth. Apparently colonies on Venus, so they don't have much of an economic return yet from that. That's mostly exploratory. Colonies on the moon, with presumably things they do there, and maybe a few asteroids. I don't know, but at any rate, you know, mankind is expanding out into the solar system, and you know that'd be kind of cool. Except it uses a lot of water, and Hilder's thinking, "Oh, we're gonna run out of water. We can't allow that." So he wants to restrict the amount to just too little for these people here in the Martian way, whose job it is to look for all the pieces of spacecraft that get ejected, you know, like stages and other parts of rockets that are actually full of lots of valuable metals. I mean, apparently some of this stuff has got things like iridium and, you know, valuable elements that, you know, and it's just floating in space because we needed it temporarily, and then the rocket just jettisoned this thing so it's not hauling it around everywhere. But it's floating out in space somewhere, and these scavengers basically would use a lot of water chasing these fragments down and bringing them, you know, to Mars basically, and using scrap metal that they can either use for construction or sell to the Earth or a moon or wherever, and that's what they do. So the next piece of artwork we have in here is the here's a astronaut here. He's from that ship in the background, and in the foreground he's doing some welding. He puts his name on a piece of metal there that he's helping to retrieve as a way of showing that at least he has a share in its recovery, and then he gets some of the profits. Okay. And a little later on, there's a really interesting picture here. You just see it's a 2-page picture, and you just see there's this guy on the end of the line just kind of floating. If you look in the distance, though, there's another ship where there's another guy floating on the end of the line, another ship where another guy's floating on the end of the line, and there's Saturn way in the background, which they're on their way to. And the idea is they're floating in space, just floating because they like to float in space. And there's a rather marvelous description of this whole thing. I'm just going to look at this, page 28. Let's see here. Or 29. Let's see here. So, I thought that's where it was. Maybe it's closer to that picture. Let's go. 30, 31. Oh goodness, there was something here. Oh, space floating. Oh, okay. It's on page 30. I don't know, it's page 33. Space closed in, and it was like sleep. Your suit was warm. It renewed its air automatically. It had food and drink in special containers from which it could be sucked with minimal motion of the head. It took care of wastes appropriately. Most of all, more than anything else, there was the delightful euphoria of weightlessness. You never felt so well in your life. The days stopped being too long. They weren't long enough, and there weren't enough of them. They had passed Jupiter's orbit at a spot some 30 degrees from its then position, which would have placed it in a right through a cluster of its Trojan satellites, because in each major planet in the solar system, you have a little group of asteroids it's about a third of about 30 degrees away, some ahead, some 30 degrees behind. They call these Trojan asteroids. They're kind of like a little cluster that, it's just one of those mathematical things of orbits that asteroid. It's one of the little spots that asteroids will tend to congregate. But apparently they passed through one of those little bodies of Trojan asteroids without harm, I guess. When this was written, they didn't know about Trojans. So anyway, 30 degrees from then position. For months, it was the brightest object in the sky, always excepting the glowing white pea that was the sun. At its brightest, some of the scavengers insisted that they would make out Jupiter as a tiny sphere. Then, over a period of additional months, it faded while another dot of light grew until it was brighter than Jupiter. It was Saturn, first as a dot of brilliance, then as an oval, glowing splotch. Why oval? Someone asked. After a while, someone else said, the rings, of course. It was obvious. It's like in Marooned Off Vesta. Vesta has a lot of this carbon dioxide stuff. Yeah, that's why it has a high albedo. So we actually had to throw in a little bit of, okay, that's true. So everyone space floated at all possible times toward the end, watching Saturn incessantly. And you have a whole bunch of dialogue, like, hey, give me more of it, and that kind of stuff. Now, what's fascinating, this is 1952, and it so well predicts how it was that astronaut Ed White felt when he did his spacewalk. Now, Alexei Leonov probably felt the same way when he had his little 10-minute spacewalk. Unfortunately, we really didn't hear a whole lot of details. Just see these blurry television, black and white television pictures of somebody kind of floating off in space on the end of a line for about 10 minutes, and he gets back in. And Ed White decided, since we weren't first, we could do the next best thing by doing twice as much. So we had to stay out a full 20 minutes. I think he managed to squeeze in an extra minute or so. While he was on his spacewalk, the first American spacewalk of Gemini 4, with McDivitt in the spacecraft, and there he is just floating around, he said, I feel like $1 million. It really felt good floating around in space. And then, when he had to go in, this was the saddest day of my life. I wonder if it was quite as sad as the day he died in the Apollo 1 fire, but he may not have had time to feel sad about the life that he was losing at that moment. Which is kind of a shame, but, same guy. He was one of the 3 in the Apollo 1 fire a little bit later. But he was our first spacewalker. But later on, and in fact, this even talks about it, if you're just floating, it's easy, it's nice, it's euphoric, great. But if you actually got to do stuff, it's actually doing anything is really hard work in space. You work up a sweat in that spacesuit of yours. Just try to screw something in because you try to turn something one way, and right away, all of you starting to spin in the opposite direction. Whoa! You are weightless. And, you have to be careful. You don't just put your tool down somewhere because it'll just float off. If it's not magnetic and sticking somewhere, it's probably going to just wander off if you don't pay attention to it. So, there's just a lot of stuff like that you have to be real slow, careful about, and you have to really think. So, and he anticipated both of these things. How important it would be just to float on the end of a tether off a rocket in weightlessness, and on the other hand, how hard the work would be when you've actually got to do something in weightlessness. So, he describes both things really well. I like that. There's another picture. All right. Let's see. We had this next picture, right? Yeah, they were floating. Okay. And this is when they brought back a huge chunk of ice, kind of this big tall thing, to the planet Mars, where everyone's really thrilled because now they've got a new source of water. And this gets down to the reason for the title, The Martian Way. The Earth way is to depend on Earth, which is fine if you're an Earther, but we are Martians. We have become like a new breed, a new way of thinking, a new way of looking at things. We're going to look for stuff out here in space and not just stay dependent on Earth. So in a way, Hilder's attempt to shut things down as far as space exploration just forced the Martian colony to do something really smart, and that is start getting their ice from the rings of Saturn rather than from the oceans of Earth. And that, in a nutshell, is the title. I may have given away too much there, but at any rate, so it's an interesting story in many ways. Some of the whole mechanics of how they do stuff, and then how things can go wrong and have to be fixed or whatever, gets a little tedious. But it was an important classic at the time, and like I said, it anticipated spacewalks with a surprising amount of very good detail. Well, I think that's all I have to say about that one. Thanks for listening.